Imagine, it was the summer of 1945, but not the same as we would celebrate today. Here, Hitler had accomplished what no one would have dreamed of doing. The Allies had already surrendered, extinguishing the hopes for freedom. Like a storm before a cyclone, a peculiar calm prevailed all over Europe. To those who lived through it, felt like the world had been turned inside out. Where buildings once stood as symbols of freedom, the swastika and Nazi eagle were now forcibly imposed. A war that would never return governed several countries across the continent, but had left behind a peculiar uneasy silence that settled like debris. Berlin was where the call had to go from, to London, to Paris, to Rome. Those people found it easy to adapt to the new course of things. Nevertheless, others kept their heads down and mourned over the defeat of the resistance movement. Families prepared for an uncertain tomorrow against an eerie, unfamiliar Europe. Everything else also changed. Germany now had a lot to say about its conception of a new order that would guarantee peace and enjoy the unity of countries and their wealth, but only in return for something. Normal Europeans would not be able to rejoice or parade in triumph. They had to accept their new situation. So now we are left with a question: how would Europe have looked without the iron grip of certain countries? Was it fear and power that ultimately shattered it? Let's explore this alternative history in more depth, imagining how this present-day reality may have been shaped completely differently. It is hard to ignore how the world stood as a silent witness to Hitler's invasion of Europe and the establishment of the Third Reich as the new order. Within several weeks after the victory, Nazi leaders hastily modified the rules and governance of the German-occupied territories by vandalizing the political ideals of democracy that they had conquered and plundered. Parliaments and cabinets were disposed of and were replaced by Nazi appointee loyalists who took their orders from Berlin. The capital aimed at free Europe, but the first step was the free unification of German territories. Now, Germany has expanded and created far more extensive borders. The territories included large areas in France, portions of Poland, and the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. These places are no longer independent states. They are now a part of Greater Germany. German signs have no shadow of doubt to the landscape, indicating that the others will lose their distinctiveness with each passing day. British territories in London have been joined, redeployed, and resolved to be used for Nazi propaganda whenever needed. The British were once mighty people with pride and self-esteem and could now take orders from Nazis stationed at Westminster. People were not shaken by the ringing bells of the famous clock tower, Big Ben, witnessing the freedom of their country. Rather, such bells now served German forces to keep track of the number of hours between shifts. A major overhaul was also undertaken by Nazi leaders across the continent. German politician Adolf Hitler began with a violent ideology and actions. He suppressed opposition by forcing all political activities outside the Nazi party to shut down. Political protests are extinct due to the fact people live in fear of jail. Thus, Germany became the jewel in the center of Europe, its core, and any potential adversary was quickly silenced. In Paris, things were more or less similar. France was regarded as a trophy owing to their victory. The French resistance leaders had to retreat into hiding, and there were more cases of them getting captured. During the time of the Nazis in command, Paris was no longer referred to as the City of Light. It became the opposite, a dark, brutal reminder of what happens to those who resist. This new Europe fit in with the Nazi order, which was based on the idea of iron rule. All of them subordinated to Hitler's will in terms of governance and control. Hitler's vision of a European empire was a unified Europe, ruled by Germans, with the boundaries of countries like France, Poland, and Denmark disappearing. Berlin's ambitions to redraw European borders began to materialize, as Hitler believed that a European empire was not a continent made up of intermingling nations and cultures, as cohabitation was out of the question. This new Europe was an Aryan nation-state, where only a race of people defined by Hitler was found. Beautiful local places like Prague, Amsterdam, and Vienna, known for their different languages and cultures, became German-speaking cities. People saw the German language everywhere, until the semblance of the non-German-speaking population was gone. Schools pushed Nazi propaganda literature on children, teaching them that Czech, Dutch, and Hungarians were Germans and part of a larger Germany. Hitler instigated population transfers in Eastern Europe as part of this concept. Sites of Germanization were established, wherein Nazis were ordered to move people who possessed suitable qualities, categorized as Aryans. People who were not Aryans were rounded up, birched, and even killed. The rural areas were infected as well. Territories that previously belonged to Polish and Ukrainian farms were confiscated and occupied by German families who were instructed to work on the land to expand Hitler's ever-increasing empire. Ex-Polish or Ukrainian farmers were reduced to laborers on the very land they used to farm their heads down in the dirt, in submission to freshly appointed German farmers feigning as overseers. Nazi iconography and German-styled buildings spread throughout urban areas, from the Eiffel Tower to Danish castles. These structures were used to power Nazi forces, and cities became systematically arranged, with Germany's intellectuals and culture as the main center. Europe, not arising from national unity, was recreated within the massive, tightly controlled German Empire as Hitler wished. In this new era, instead of a mercenary, the economy became a tool of subjugation to the Nazi regime. With unrelenting determination, Hitler's picture of a self-reliant continent was put into action, and Europe became an organized structure with Germany at its center. The entire economy, including all firms and sectors, were monopolized by the Nazi regime for the sole purpose of waging war and expansionism. At this juncture, only those businesses were able to operate that the Nazis approved. Family businesses, local producers, and independent farms, which used to be the foundation of Europe's economy, had to seek the state's approval, or else they were nationalized. Factories were ordered to transform their products to only those which served the purposes of the Reich. He unilateralizes all developed industries from Paris to Prague towards the German economy. The routine activities of the civilians became quite different. Most food items became scarce, with products mostly redirected to Germany or other Nazi-approved projects. Farmers who would harvest foodstuffs for their respective communities now toiled as bonded laborers, with the crops grown only for those who were deemed fit as Aryans. Rations were reduced or eliminated entirely for those who frowned at Hitler's wicked racial agenda. More factories were built in cities like Essen and valleys like the Ruhr. These factories merged large-scale operations armed with millions of enslaved people from conquered territories. These laborers, many from Eastern Europe, who were hounded like dogs, worked in appalling conditions, producing weapons, vehicles, and paraphernalia for the Reich under threat of terrorism. This massive involuntary workforce depicted the horrific price of the Nazis' economic strategy that was glossed over with propaganda of a unified and thriving German economy. A central power guided every purchase, every position, and every service. Life was secure and balanced around an elite that determined who would prevail and who would struggle to survive. Moreover, Poland had been restarted by Europe's economy and was no longer based upon expansion or enrichment. Rather, it revolved around subjugation, authority, and the absolute dominance of a single barbaric ideology. The Hitler-controlled Europe transformed daily life in an unprecedented way. From one corner of the continent to the other, attention to cultural endeavors, the kind of music played, the types of books in circulation, even the subjects of conversations, was central and catered for. The culture, art, and literature that had previously celebrated and represented the very essence of the European people's plural worldviews were turned into a monolithic and faceless propaganda machine. Über alles, the Reich radio did not serve for news from the family or abroad, but for something completely different: state-sponsored programs. Its primary purpose became the mouthpiece of the Nazi Party, which packed the airwaves with tightly scripted programs. Nightly transmission now became a tool that berated the citizens with pre-manufactured stories of regime virtues and telling tales of enemies. Families tuned in not for news and/or information, but rather for Nazi assets to showcase how far victories had been achieved, portraying democracy as a disconcerting factor to people's welfare. Commemorating anything insensitive towards the regime was not allowed. To establish dominance over the rest of the world, literature was destroyed. Books, poetry, novels, and philosophies that did not conform to Nazi ideals were stripped from the bookshelves. Instead, the libraries and bookshelves had state-endorsed books intended for people who cherished the supremacy of the Reich and the condemnation of liberty and equality. Classics of literature written by banned authors disappeared, and instead, altered editions that depicted the image of pure German culture began to flourish. Writers, musicians, and artists who did not listen were oppressed. Many of them went into exile and their voices vanished. Art was not any different. Paintings and sculptures idealized Aryan spindle and barbarism, and abstract art that once incorporated heterogeneous elements into the more general composition was not permitted. All exhibitions, from museums to public places, must only bring out the works representing the dream of an Aryan society. The physical manifestations of its abstract hatred had no place in the German-created realism. This regulation was implemented not only in visual arts, but also in the music industry. Forget about jazz, swing, and any other genre that the Nazis deemed as against the empire. The only official orchestra music performed was the one that the rulers and the concert halls permitted, which were constantly filled with the sounds of Bach and Wagner's music. For the average European, this degraded personal independence was a gradual suppression of culture. Public discussions were carried out in whispers, for a loud or discontented tone could lead to dire consequences. People learned to keep their heads down, smile, and avoid remarks. The Reich had indeed succeeded in coercing art, music, and literature, controlling what people thought and what they could see. As such, daily life for Reich members was an exercise in subservience. From radio programs to works of art on the walls, everywhere people looked and listened, they were surrounded by elements promoting the Reich's ideals, increasing its power over the citizens, a little quiet but controlled at all times. After the conquest, schools became institutions of oppression, where learning was controlled and directed at blind obedience to Hitler. It was hard to deny the textbooks, which came under the tight Nazi administration that looked at things through a controlled prism of glorified German supremacy. Children became a part of this very stringent educational system from an early age. History lessons only eulogized German victories and Aryan champions, most prominently Hitler and his generals. Pages dedicated to great men like Julius Caesar and Charlemagne were altered so that their respective characters corresponded to Nazi standards. This forged a narrative that subtly placed German lineage as the rightful successors of European civilization. In the past, science classes always looked for something that improved a bit. According to the biology textbooks, students created a fantasy of their antagonistic worldview towards race. People are divided fairly on their appearance and snobbishly look at others besides the perfect Aryan look-alike. Darwin's theories were abused in social sciences to transform the conflict of life to mean survival of the fittest, which allowed other races to be perceived as superior. It means that young children have been shaped and raised with such lies and were trained to follow such prejudices as if they were the truth. Physical education was also transformed. Boys were to develop capabilities of fulfilling duties in the Wehrmacht, and girls were expected to perform supportive roles. Boys and girls were trained and taught using combat-oriented, durational practical exercises. For as long as one can remember, children were taught values that portrayed strength and endurance as special attributes of a superior species. The Nazi regime did not view writing and art as methods that people carry out to express themselves in school. Instead, they read full and beautiful texts by such authors as Shakespeare and Goethe's young students. In the art assignments, students created posters of Hitler. The faculties were instructed to correct any inventiveness of the children that did not correspond to the state norms. This made kids link art with obeying the rules, and not even having to think of the self. This system raised a generation that saw themselves more as cogs in a big wheel like slaves. They were shown how to conform, shut up, and align their dreams to the dreams of the Reich. Hitler required that education be controlled not only in the present but also in the future. He wished to ensure that he would control the minds of learners who were trained servants without their minds. Thus, in Nazi Europe, those institutions and the school became places where people went to discover the virtue of silence and obedience. As the Nazis took over every country, city, and institution, the question stayed. Could the resistance stay alive in such a harsh environment? Defiance in Nazi Germany was strong, with women and men forming secret networks in controlled areas, meeting in caves or woods, and communicating in code. Former troops, disillusioned citizens, church leaders, and teenagers put their lives on the line to protest the Nazi government. They also created fake papers revealing the regime's crimes, despite being watched, saving their short messages and careful words. The Nazis knew how this kind of resistance would come and reacted with crushing force. They made it so that there were always cruel, efficient cops looking in the shadows. Gestapo, SS spies, and local sources in the towns found resistance groups before they could become stronger. People were suspicious of every word, look, and late-night meetings. Those caught with resistance materials or merely hanging out with people thought to be members were grabbed without a hearing and often disappeared without a trace. Defiance cost a lot of people their lives. The people fighting in the resistance were brutally put down in Warsaw. Lots of Nazi soldiers roamed the streets of the city, beating people and keeping people from rising. The Polish underground was strong, though. A complicated system of tunnels and safe places worked. But these rebels also gave information to the Allies, messed up Nazi supply lines, painted X's on walls, and had symbolic acts of resistance. They often died for their bravery. In France, some members of the French resistance were conscripted to fight harsh conditions. Once a strong army, they had died off. Their leaders were killed or taken. Every street corner said Nazi propaganda signs. Even with these problems, the French resistance worked in small groups in secret, striking wherever they could without being noticed. If they were caught, they were certain to die. In Europe, resistance movements also grew from groups that didn't seem to go together. Nazi haters included priests, teachers, and shop owners, all who fought the Nazis. When the government was chasing people, they would hide them in churches, attics, and empty buildings. They would set up networks of smugglers. These were people saving lives, planning getaway paths, and trading fake documents in these hidden safe places. The Nazis got stronger and stronger as the years passed. Fighting back would inspire others, and they worked hard to remove this network. Known supporters were shamed, made to be put on display, or killed to make people afraid. Things were really bad, so they had to keep it even more secret. Talks got rarer, and codes grew shorter and more complex. In Paris, agents spread the word through a light, a chalk mark on a wall, a word quietly whispered. The rebel forces were still moving, even if things were hard. They fought the Reich, but the Reich suppressed them. They were even images of hope to people who felt they needed to be free. Even though they had to hide and be quiet in this alternate Europe, these brave people showed that Nazi rule could never fully destroy a force. To fight, even though the chances did not seem possible, for a future that might never be. Resistance here wasn't anger, it was how spirit could stay alive. The Reich was so strong that it could never muffle the voices of people who didn't want to quit, no matter how bad things were. Life turned on its head in Europe under some unseen, impenetrable monitoring mask. Everywhere was a stage, and every day was a practice run, so no one noticed you were suspicious. Living in the Reich, people knew everything around them, and a single word or a glance was enough to have terrible results. Fear and familiarity have been used to control people by the Nazi government better than any other government has done. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, went into every village and town. It doesn't matter if you're as red as a fire truck or as pale as a sheet. Anyone could be a spy. This only got better because loyalty was not only expected, it was demanded. Nobody dared exhibit even the slightest suggestion of disloyalty. But families watched over other families, and friends watched over other friends, ready to report any unpatriotic behavior. Privacy was no more for regular people. The Nazis could have overheard all calls and chats. Vague words and criticism of any government, even within their own home. People learned to use and stay away from the slightest hint at the slightest bit critical of the government. Second, the kitchen and living room were no longer open, private spaces, and no longer the center of family life. Instead, family get-togethers were now staged events where people talked of safe, state-approved themes. Even kids were controlled by this method. Nazi youth groups indoctrinated them with the lesson to inform authorities if they saw anything odd in their own homes, and to place Reich loyalty above family relationships. The students were asked to think of any family members who spoke out against the Reich as part of loyalty exercises. Parents were so afraid of their kids since they should say something and get arrested, questioned, or worse. Over the years, the SS and Gestapo had more creative ways to keep people under control. They were told that over and over again, loyal Germans have nothing to fear. So people with any question whatsoever became paranoid. SS officers sometimes would not enter homes with a warning. but would come in and search for illegal books, foreign music records, or anything else potentially dangerous. These visits were called checks. During these nervous checks, families held their breath, waiting if their loyalty would not be questioned, or if an innocuous possession wouldn't be seen as a sign of discontent. Still, they were too stuffy, even in public places. But parks, coffee shops, and markets were tense places. People spoke quietly, and no one would meet others' eyes. The buildings and streets were plastered with signs that read, "The Führer is watching." It was supposed to remind people that anyone, anywhere at any time could be hearing. They only spoke in coded terms and looked over their shoulders, and the few people who were brave enough to get together in small groups. Short and carefully chosen words were their talks. This constant monitoring brought down society. In a world where everyone is suspicious, people have lost the trust, loyalty, and friendship that used to be part of European society. This ended Europe's transformation into a society with armor. Under this kind of totalitarianism, people learned to watch what they did and what they thought, limiting themselves just enough to stay out of the eyes of a government that could see everything. In this alternate dark world, even the most normal parts of life were given up in a continent ruled by fear, united by one reason. Hitler wanted Europe to turn into a pure land, so he eliminated the various cultures and identities for which each country had been known. He did this by forcing everyone to believe the Nazi ideas. Every part of the conquered lands was affected by Hitler's policies of cultural purity. In short, he changed Europe's history to be representative of a single, uniform identity, Germanic, Aryan, and fine with Nazis. This wasn't a simple political takeover. It was an organized taking of life from the continent's soul. From the beginning, the Reich wanted to get rid of pieces of European society. Jewish, Roman, and Slavic people were systematically pushed to the poles. The Reich had killed the once full of rituals, music, and language Jewish areas, made them factories and government offices, or simply left them to fall apart as a warning of how powerful the Reich was. Warsaw, Vienna, and Paris all had lively communities that were now spooky ruins. They persecuted people following some other faiths, speaking minority languages and keeping their traditions. The Nazi government had a strategy called Germanization, which involved people that had to change their name to German, speak only German, and embrace only Nazi-approved traditions. Hitler wanted everyone to be the same. Therefore, festivities, dances, and holidays held in the past were not allowed. Slavic culture is no longer heard in public places like Budapest and Bucharest. They are willing to be diverse in Roman music. Songs and stories were the blood of those villages. Now it was quiet. They even took art and buildings and used it to turn people into assemblages. European paintings, statues, and objects were taken down and put back by pieces that venerated Aryan power and were Germanic. These were the most famous works at the Louvre, which had been taken away or burnt. They were taken away with masterpieces from artists outside of Europe. They knew the museum as a sign of world culture and felt their loss. This resulted in buildings being rebuilt to reflect the harsh, uniform look of the Nazis. But those stark, imposing fronts were made into monuments to the Reich by changing or destroying the grand churches and other historic sites. And even the most private parts of a person's personality were erased in Hitler's new Europe. People had to look and act in certain ways to fit in with Aryan ideas. The Nazi government relocated to the style of hair, eye, and face shape, and people had to adhere to very strict beauty requirements. People with non-Aryan physical traits were mistrusted, and those lacking these standards were sent to corrective treatment or left alone. It produced a savage society in which being different was bad, and the wide range of personal identity was surrendered for a sharp unity of sameness. On the food side, even that was standardized, especially something that's such a big part of national expression. Nazi leaders divined what was acceptable food, and based on that chose German staples over regional dishes. The food the government approved was boring. In such times of crisis, store shelves saw Italian noodles, French desserts, and Eastern European soups, or whatever the international equivalent of those was, taken off and replaced. People tried to be more like everyone else, but local tastes and cooking practices died out. For example, cafes stopped serving croissants, and trattorias stopped making pasta in Italy. The harsh rules of Nazi Europe allowed them to wipe away the identities that had given the continent the status of a patchwork of nations. Languages and accents died off. Towns worldwide began to look the same. For this reason, children learned only that version of history that the Nazis approved of, not those customs and stories that came to form their background. This pure Europe wasn't about freedom of speech or recognition of the many identities that had once defined it. Culture had become either a sign of life to be celebrated or of enslavement. It meant there would always be no color, never a choice, and no history for the next generation to grow up in. Hitler's promise of peace in Europe was nothing more than a dream. With it, Hitler made quick work of bringing the rest of Europe closer to one that would never know peace. Here, life is always on the edge of war. They believed that the only way to ensure everyone was safe was to fight. Peace was never meant to end the wars. Peace was a temporary break in a continual preparation cycle for the next war. The Nazi government was required to be constantly in a state of caution. Hitler believed that Europe's security was unstable and could break any time. He always thought about enemies, mostly the Soviet Union, because there were moral threats and military threats. Now the whole continent, after having just been reconstructed by the Nazis, was put on a footing to prepare for a war that was never actually called by name, but which always seemed imminent. Frequently, European factories worked without stopping to make weapons, cars, and supplies. Under the regime's rules, the government took over businesses and stopped using them for private purposes. These plants turned into castles of real production gear going all the time. Workers did hard, repeated jobs that were very tiring as they met the never-ending demand for guns and ammo. What had been factories during peacetime would now make tanks instead of tractors and jet planes instead of cars. As the money flowed into this going-nowhere development, there was no money to keep real people fed, clothes provided, or menial jobs fulfilled. Everyone started sharing everything from food to clothes. This was to help with the Reich's war goals. Schools became places where future fighters and commanders could be taught how to fight. Military strategies, loyalty to the state, and physical toughness were prized more than academic subjects. The basic fighting skills were taught to little boys. They learned those lessons: weapon handling, discipline, and being alive. They didn't study literature or philosophy. They read military history. They learned how much better Nazi policy was, and all they learned was Aryan victories. There was a reason they were training girls too. They learned how to help troops on the field, take care of hurt men, and make sure future ones will be strong. The government won't let this machine stop. They stoked a fear of attack, especially from the east. Propaganda showed the Soviet Union as an ever-threatened enemy and was prepared to strike at any time. Soviet forces were depicted as scary monsters, and people were warned to be careful because they were a threat to the Reich's safety, according to posters. Hitler was convincing people to think exactly how he wanted them to for no other reason than to make everyone feel paranoid. Living in a world at war was normal. Life had to be adjusted daily, and rules had to be followed. Workplaces were for men, support work for women, and troops were trained for the kids. During the war effort, entire families either helped directly or indirectly. Resources were scarce, since the Reich prioritized military needs over everything else. People had no time for frivolities, but people were told that honor still existed, and that it was a small price to pay to be safe in the Reich when they were simply pieces of apparatus to keep the fighting going. This harsh peace had a distancing effect, and European people put life at arm's length. During the working time of the government, which was set for war, their own goals, aspirations, and dreams were put aside. They weren't all roads to a better future. They all led back into the fight. In this horrid view of history, peace was not at rest from war, but in an endless spiral into the military. After the Nazis left power, Europe was nothing at all like the bustling, cosmopolitan continent that it had been. The rule of the Reich over so many years changed Europe forever, warping its identity, culture, and values with fear, abuse, and monotony. When a country is under Nazi rule, countries start losing the singularities of their country and becoming more alike to each other. These were the only values known to the children born in this world. These people had never heard of individuality, variety, or free speech. For a guy who wanted to spread his wings, the land suddenly possessed one repressive identity. It used to be that freedom, a variety of choices, and being allowed to speak your mind without fear of reprisal. What used to be writers and artists, people who pushed the limits, were replaced by people who did what the government deemed was okay. That was the philosophy by which children and teens of that age were raised and did not know anything else, only what they were told. It had all been changed to add to one worldview: culture, education, and even the most trivial elements of daily life. Thus, children were taught Reich's version of history and believed other societies were bad or dangerous. In the olden days, the arts were a means of celebrating Europe's diversity, but the arts were turned into propaganda to support the regime's ideas. Nobody knew what traditional songs sounded like, what regional food tasted like, or what it was like to see things from their point of view. Instead, they had to live in a dull, government-authorized society where they stopped being creative and had their history wiped out. Europe's land and mines bore scars from having been left for years by a constant military presence. Towns had been built to keep people alive, not to make them rich, and the land had turned into a fortress. Drastic industries were only working on war with the use up of resources and the possibility of ever getting a better economy. All over Europe, towns were changed to bunkers and watchtowers. Many men and women were raised in a military society where military service was all they were taught to do. Their lives were full of tasks without hope, desire, or personal growth. It was all people were waiting for, to be watched, suspected, and scared out of their most private time. They self-censored, distrusted others, and feared going outside of what the government said was okay. Dealing with a mind that is scared up so much affects people's lives. They feared what would happen if they spoke, so they learned to hide how they felt. Over time, mistrust became the norm, and friends, co-workers, and even family lost touch with one another. They broke down the things that keep society going, such as trust, kindness, and connections. People now live in fear and solitude. This continent was once swarming with populous, linked towns, but now it sounded cold and remote, and its people no longer connected. Europe lost itself. Its heart, soul, and reason for being were gone. Under the harsh rule, many generations' hopes and goals were suspended. Formerly, nations would contribute to a shared history, to the identities and achievements of the nations and the world. Nations were left without a place, identity, or achievement. Hitler's success was brought at the cost of lives to the people of this darker Europe. They had no wealth or peace, people lost their identities, and their opinions were silenced. However, we tend to dismiss what freedom of speech means and our rights to free speech, creativity, and life without the fear of being nailed. This offers us a peep into what mattered in those war years. The present is more than what history creates. It defines the future, the ideals that will follow, and the world we leave behind. The bravery to stand up and fight for freedom kept Europe lush with art, culture, and uniqueness while keeping it a place. It makes us realize that our freedom is easily taken away, and that a better Europe was created by a gift that had to be earned, not one granted, as it is a gift. A road that won over a darker future, one that thankfully remained a shadow. So for a last trip through a new past, we leave with a strong idea of what could have been and what was at stake. In this imagined Europe, once laden with rich cultures, customs, and strong beliefs, the land was erased and replaced with a brutal monotone. It was a world where one valued control instead of freedom, and where differences were flaws, not strengths. Thinking about this other past makes us better appreciate the freedoms and differences that define today's world. Because of the bravery of those who fought to protect these ideals, we remember how much freedom costs and how hard people have worked to get it. Together, they fought for Europe as a place where differences were prized, creativity was cultivated, and each of us was of equal value. Otherwise, we might not know this Europe. The impact we'll leave for tomorrow will depend on what we give up right now.